The overhead light in hotel rooms is always too bright. I've noticed this in every city, every business trip, every sterile box they call temporary home. This one cast everything in harsh relief. The burgundy comforter pulled tight across the king-sized bed, the generic landscape painting screwed permanently into the wall, my suit jacket draped over the armchair like a shed skin. The whiskey in my glass had gone warm hours ago, but I kept holding it anyway, if only to have something to do with my hands. Across the room, Marcus stood at the bathroom sink, brushing his teeth with the methodical precision he brought to everything. The sound of bristles against enamel filled the silence between us, a rhythm that somehow made the quiet more pronounced. I could see his reflection in the mirror. Tie gone, sleeves rolled up, the careful composure he wore at the office finally beginning to crack at the edges. He caught my eye in the glass for just a moment, then looked away, spitting toothpaste into the porcelain basin with more force than necessary. Earlier, when we'd first walked into this room, when the concierge had handed us the single key card with that practiced smile, Marcus had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came too quick, too bright, designed to deflect whatever awkwardness might settle between us. "Don't make this weird," he'd said, dropping his overnight bag at the foot of the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like we'd done this 100 times before. I had laughed too. Too quickly. Too loudly. The sound had bounced off the walls and died somewhere near the heavy curtains that blocked out the Vancouver skyline. Now, 3 hours later, the joke felt thin as paper. I shifted on the edge of the mattress, the springs creaking beneath me in a way that seemed to announce every small movement. My tie hung loose around my neck, the Windsor knot I perfected over 20 years of corporate presentations finally undone. There was something liberating about it, and something terrifying too, as if loosening one thing might cause everything else to unravel. The divorce had been final for 8 months now. 8 months of learning to live alone again, of discovering that silence could be both a blessing and a curse. Evelyn had taken most of the furniture, not out of spite, but out of practicality. She was the one who'd picked it all out anyway, who'd had opinions about thread counts and color schemes while I'd nodded along, grateful someone was making the decisions. What remained was the skeleton of our life together. A couch, a coffee table, the bed we'd shared for 9 years, but had stopped really sleeping in long before the papers were signed. I'd become good at compartments. Professional Julian, who never missed a deadline and always knew where the quarterly reports were filed. Reliable Julian, who brought donuts to morning meetings and remembered everyone's coffee orders. Invisible Julian, who moved through the office like a ghost, efficient and forgettable and never, ever a source of drama. But Marcus had a way of looking at me that made those compartments feel fragile. He finished in the bathroom and emerged in a white undershirt and dark pajama pants, the uniform of men who'd learned to dress down without ever fully letting their guard down. The overhead light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, a detail I'd noticed more and more during late-night strategy sessions, when the fluorescent office lights revealed things the daylight kept hidden. We'd worked together for 3 years. 3 years of meetings and presentations and casual conversations by the coffee machine. 3 years of watching him lean back in his chair during conference calls, fingers drumming against the table, that half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth when someone said something particularly ridiculous. 3 years of learning that he took his coffee black, that he had a sister in Portland who called too much, that he'd once spent a summer teaching English in Prague and came back with stories that made everyone laugh. 3 years of pretending I didn't notice the way my pulse quickened when he walked into a room. The bed was wide enough that we could both sleep without touching, which should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like an ocean. Marcus pulled back the covers on his side, the crisp hotel linens making that particular sound they make. Professional, impersonal, temporary. He sat down heavily, the mattress dipping under his weight, and for a moment the distance between us felt both infinite and impossibly small. He reached for the lamp on his bedside table, then paused. "Do you mind if I turn this off?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The room plunged into darkness, save for the thin line of light that crept in beneath the door and the occasional sweep of headlights from the street below. I could hear Marcus settling under the covers, the rustle of fabric, the soft sigh he always made when he finally let himself relax. I'd noticed it during long flights, when he'd fall asleep against the airplane window, all his careful professionalism dissolving into something softer, more vulnerable. I finished the whiskey in one burning swallow and set the glass on the nightstand with a soft clink. Then I stood, my legs unsteady from sitting too long, and began the ritual of undressing. Shoes first, then socks, then the shirt I'd worn to 3 different presentations that day. Each piece of clothing felt like armor being stripped away, leaving me more exposed than I'd been in years. When I finally slipped under the covers, the sheets were cool against my skin, stiff with the chemical cleanliness of industrial laundering. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of every sound. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of traffic, the steady rhythm of Marcus breathing just a few feet away. This was the part one hadn't prepared for. The logistics of sharing space with someone who'd somehow managed to slip under my carefully constructed defenses without either of us acknowledging what was happening. We'd maintained our professional distance for 3 days of meetings and presentations. But here, in the dark, with nothing but hotel linens between us and honesty, that distance felt as fragile as everything else. A truck rumbled past on the street below, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling in a slow arc of yellow light. For just a moment, I could see Marcus's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the peaceful expression that made him look younger than his 35 years. He shifted slightly, turning toward my side of the bed, and my breath caught in my throat. For the first time in years, I felt the unbearable pull of being seen. Not the careful, professional version of myself I'd perfected for conference rooms and quarterly reviews, but something rawer, more honest. Something I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it had never existed. The truck passed, taking its light with it, and we were plunged back into darkness. But something had shifted in those few seconds of illumination, something I couldn't name and couldn't ignore. I closed my eyes and tried to match my breathing to his, tried to find sleep in the rhythm of shared space, an unspoken possibility. Tomorrow we'd return to our separate roles, our professional distance, our carefully maintained boundaries. But tonight, in this sterile room with its too bright overhead light and its single king-sized bed, I lay awake and let myself want something I hadn't allowed myself to want in 20 years. I lay awake and listened to Marcus breathe and felt my life beginning to crack open at the seams. The townhouse I returned to after business trips always felt too quiet. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen island that Evelyn had insisted we needed for entertaining guests who rarely came. She'd left her handwriting on the refrigerator calendar, dental appointments and book club meetings scheduled months into a future we'd never share. I kept meaning to replace it, but there was something honest about those abandoned plans, something that reminded me how easily a life could be divided into before and after. The spare bedroom upstairs still held the ghost of what we'd planned it to become. Neutral paint colors chosen with careful optimism. A reading chair positioned near the window where morning light would have been perfect for feeding times. We talked about children the way other couples talked about vacation destinations. Someday, when the timing was right, when the promotion came through, when we felt ready. But ready for what exactly? I'd never been able to articulate the specific readiness we were waiting for, and eventually the conversation just stopped happening. My real life took place in compartments now. The morning routine, black coffee from the machine Evelyn had left behind because it matched the countertops, NPR playing low while I knotted my tie in the hallway mirror, checking for any detail that might make me memorable. The goal was always to be forgettable, efficient, dependable, invisible. At Morrison & Associates, I'd perfected the art of being indispensable without being notable. Reliable Julian, they called me. The man who knew where every file lived, who remembered which clients preferred morning meetings, who could be counted on to stay late when deadlines loomed. I brought donuts to department meetings and remembered birthdays and never, ever caused drama. But I also watched Marcus Lavine in ways that felt dangerous. He joined the company 3 years ago, hired away from a boutique consulting firm in Seattle with promises of better benefits and proximity to his sister in Portland. Where I was methodical, he was intuitive. Where I chose my words carefully, he spoke in streams of consciousness that somehow always landed exactly where they needed to. He wore colorful socks, bright blues and deep purples that peeked out when he crossed his legs during presentations. He slouched in meetings, made everyone laugh, and had opinions about everything from software integration to the terrible coffee in the break room. I learned his rhythms without meaning to. How he always arrived exactly 7 minutes late, carrying a cup of coffee from the place across the street because he refused to drink what the office provided. How he drummed his fingers against his thigh when he was thinking, an unconscious percussion that I found myself listening for during conference calls. How he had a way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room, leaning forward with genuine curiosity, asking follow-up questions that went deeper than small talk required. He was openly affectionate with everyone. Quick hugs for the administrative assistants, high fives after successful presentations, a hand on the shoulder when someone was struggling with a difficult client. But he was also notoriously private about his personal life. 3 years of working together, and I knew he had a sister who called too much, that he'd taught English in Prague after college, that he drove a blue Honda Civic with a dent in the back bumper from a parking garage mishap he'd never fully explained. But I didn't know if he was seeing anyone, didn't know where exactly he lived, didn't know what he did with his weekends. The mystery only sharpened my attention. My marriage to Evelyn had been built on a foundation of comfort. We'd met through mutual friends, bonded over shared tastes in movies and restaurants, fallen into a relationship that felt as natural as breathing. She was kind, intelligent, attractive in the understated way that made other husbands envious. We loved each other with the steady affection of people who'd chosen sensibly, who'd built a life together based on compatibility rather than passion. For 9 years, it had felt like enough. We developed routines, Sunday morning coffee in bed, alternating who chose the restaurant for date nights, annual vacations to places with good reviews and reliable weather. We supported each other's careers, maintained a social circle of other couples who'd made similar choices, talked about the future in careful, practical terms. But there had always been something hollow at the center of it all, something I'd assumed was normal. The way my mind wandered during intimate moments, the careful performance I'd perfected to convince both of us that I was fully present. The way I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance, playing the role of devoted husband with skill, but not conviction. Evelyn noticed first. She was always more perceptive than I gave her credit for, more willing to examine the spaces between what we said and what we felt. One evening, after I'd responded to her story about a difficult day at work with the kind of distracted listening I'd thought I was hiding better, she set down her wine glass and looked at me with the expression of someone who'd been rehearsing a difficult conversation. "Are you happy with me, Julian?" she asked. "Or are you just comfortable?" I'd opened my mouth to reassure her, to perform the role of the attentive husband who'd simply been distracted by work pressures. But something in her eyes stopped me. She already knew the answer. We both did. The divorce had been civil, almost businesslike in its efficiency. We divided assets and memories with the same careful precision we'd once used to plan our kitchen renovation. She kept the house. It had always been more hers than mine anyway. I found the townhouse through a realtor who specialized in what she called transitional properties, places for people who needed somewhere to figure out what came next. What came next, apparently, was lying awake in hotel rooms, hyper-aware of a coworker's breathing patterns, finally understanding the difference between comfort and desire. The Vancouver assignment came through in March, buried in a company-wide email about the merger with Northbridge Technologies. Most people would have skimmed past the logistics, who was traveling where, which presentations needed finalizing, the usual bureaucratic choreography of corporate integration. But I developed a habit of reading every detail twice, if only to have something to focus on besides the way Marcus was unconsciously tapping his pen against his coffee cup 3 cubicles away. 2 representatives to the week-long summit. Strategic alignment meetings. Final presentations to seal the partnership that would determine whether our smaller firm survived or dissolved into something larger and less familiar. When Marcus appeared at my desk that afternoon, hands shoved into his pockets, that half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth, I already knew what he was going to say. "Looks like we're going to Canada together," he said, leaning against my desk in that casual way that made my pulse quicken. "Think you can handle being stuck with me for a week?" I'd managed something appropriately professional in response, something about looking forward to working together on such an important project. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. I'd been hoping for this without admitting to myself that I was hoping for anything at all. The flight to Vancouver was turbulent, spring storms following us across the continent. Marcus fell asleep somewhere over the prairies, his head tilted against the window, that careful composure finally dissolving into something unguarded. I spent 2 hours pretending to read quarterly reports while actually watching the way his breathing changed the rhythm of his shoulders, the way his hair fell across his forehead when no one was performing for anyone. The Fairmont Pacific Rim was the kind of hotel designed to impress visiting executives. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, the sort of understated luxury that whispered success without shouting about it. We approached the reception desk together, our rolling suitcases making synchronized clicks across the polished stone, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever our professional distance threatened to collapse into something more personal. Julian Monroe and Marcus Lavine, I told the concierge, a woman with precise makeup and a smile that had been perfected through years of managing travelers' expectations. Checking in for the week. She typed our names into her computer with the practiced efficiency of someone who processed hundreds of these interactions each day. Then she paused, frowning slightly at her screen. "I have you both down for the same reservation," she said, glancing between us. "One king bed, correct?" The moment stretched longer than it should have. I opened my mouth to explain that there must be some mistake, that we'd need separate rooms, preferably on different floors. But Marcus spoke first. "That's right," he said, his voice carrying that same casual confidence he brought to client presentations. "Don't make this weird, Julian." He'd turned to me with a grin that was meant to deflect whatever awkwardness might settle between us, the same expression he wore when he made jokes during particularly tedious meetings. But there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. I heard myself laugh, too quickly and too loud, the sound bouncing off the marble walls like an accusation. "Of course not," I said, accepting the key cards with hands that felt steadier than they had any right to be. "Just a mix-up with the booking." But as we rode the elevator to the 18th floor, I found myself wondering if it really was a mistake. Marcus had handled all the travel arrangements, had been the one to coordinate with the corporate booking system. He was meticulous about details when it mattered, the kind of person who triple-checked presentation slides and always remembered to confirm meeting times. The kind of person who didn't make accidental reservations. The days that followed were filled with small moments that felt larger than they should have. Sharing an umbrella during an unexpected downpour, our shoulders pressed together under the narrow canopy of protection. Ordering room service at midnight after a client dinner that ran too long, sitting cross-legged on the bed in our shirt sleeves, arguing about quarterly projections while splitting a bottle of wine that made everything seem slightly more possible. There was the morning I woke to find Marcus already dressed, standing at the window with his coffee, watching the harbor in the gray pre-dawn light. He looked peaceful in a way I rarely saw during office hours, younger somehow, as if the careful professionalism he wore like armor had finally been set aside. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice still rough with sleep. He turned, and for just a moment, something unguarded passed across his face. "Just thinking," he said, "about how different everything looks from up here." But it was the dinner on our third night that changed something fundamental between us. We'd finished our meetings early, the Northbridge executives satisfied with our preliminary presentations, and found ourselves at a seafood restaurant overlooking the water. The wine was better than what we usually allowed ourselves on business trips, and the conversation had drifted away from quarterly targets and integration timelines into something more personal. Marcus was telling me about a friend from college, someone named David who'd been married for 15 years before finally admitting to himself and his family that he'd been living the wrong life. It took him until 42 to figure out who he actually was, Marcus said, swirling the wine in his glass in slow, deliberate circles. 42 years of thinking he was supposed to want something just because everyone told him it was what he should want. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching my face for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give him. The restaurant noise faded into background static, the clink of silverware, the murmur of other people's conversations, the distant sound of boats in the harbor. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" he continued, his voice softer now, more careful. "How many people are out there, living lives that don't actually fit them?" I found myself nodding, my throat tight with recognition. The wine made everything feel closer, more immediate, more dangerous. What happened to him? I asked. To David. Marcus smiled, but there was something sad in it, something that spoke to years of watching people struggle with truths they couldn't quite name. He's happier now, Marcus said. It wasn't easy, the divorce, coming out to his kids, starting over. But he said it was like finally being able to breathe after holding his breath for decades. We sat in silence after that, the weight of unspoken questions settling between us like fog rolling in from the harbor. I finished my wine and tried to pretend I didn't understand why he'd chosen to tell me that particular story on that particular night, in a city far enough from home that our usual boundaries felt negotiable. But I understood perfectly, and for the first time in my adult life, I let myself consider the possibility that some truths were worth the disruption they caused. I woke the next morning to find Marcus still asleep, his face turned toward my side of the bed, one arm stretched across the space between us, as if reaching for something in his dreams. The early Vancouver light filtered through the hotel curtains, casting everything in that particular gray gold that makes morning feel like a secret. His features were softer in sleep, the careful composure he wore during waking hours finally abandoned. Dark lashes against his cheek, lips slightly parted, the faint lines around his eyes smoothed away by unconsciousness. My heart was thudding so loudly I was certain it would wake him. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, overcome by a longing so sharp it felt like grief. This was desire, I realized with startling clarity. Not the gentle affection I'd felt for Evelyn. Not the comfortable companionship I'd mistaken for love for 9 years. This was the dangerous thing I'd spent my adult life avoiding, the pull toward another person that felt strong enough to reorganize everything I thought I knew about myself. His fingers twitched slightly where they rested on the white hotel sheet, and for one impossible moment I imagined covering his hand with mine. Just that simple gesture, skin against skin, the weight of honest touch. But I didn't move. I watched him breathe and felt my life cracking open along fault lines I pretended didn't exist. When Marcus finally stirred, stretching with the unconscious grace of someone emerging from deep sleep, I was already up, standing at the window with my coffee, pretending to study the harbor traffic. He mumbled a good morning that was rough with sleep, and I responded with something appropriately casual, both of us performing the ritual of professional colleagues sharing temporary space. But something had shifted overnight. The conversations we'd been having, careful, circling around larger truths, became more direct. Over breakfast in the hotel restaurant, Marcus talked about never quite fitting in at work, about feeling like he was performing a version of himself that satisfied everyone else's expectations but left him feeling empty. I know exactly what you mean, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. Sometimes I feel like I'm watching my own life from the outside. Like I'm an actor who's forgotten he's supposed to be playing himself. Marcus looked up from his omelet, eyes sharp with recognition. When did that start for you? He asked. The question hung in the air between us, more intimate than anything we'd shared in 3 years of working together. I found myself thinking about college, about moments I'd buried so deep I'd convinced myself they'd never happened, about the careful construction of a life that looked right from the outside, even when it felt hollow at the center. I think it's always been there, I said finally. The feeling that I was choosing safety over truth. Our eyes met across the table, and for a moment the restaurant noise faded to nothing. There was something happening here, something neither of us was naming, but both of us could feel. The space between acknowledgement and action, between wanting and having, between the life you're living and the one you might choose if you were brave enough. That afternoon, after our final presentation to the Northbridge team, we found ourselves at the hotel pool. The space was mostly empty, a few business travelers reading on lounge chairs, a woman doing laps with mechanical precision. I'd been swimming since college, one of the few physical activities that quieted my mind, but I felt self-conscious as I entered the water, hyper-aware of Marcus watching from the pool's edge. He joined me after a few minutes, diving in with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to take up space in the world. We floated near each other in the chlorinated silence, the water muffling all the sounds of the hotel around us. The afternoon light moved across the surface in shifting patterns, and I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd never had, all the questions I'd never been brave enough to ask. I used to think desire meant danger, I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. The admission felt enormous in the quiet space between us. Marcus turned in the water, his expression serious, searching. Maybe it still does, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. We looked at each other across the small distance that separated us, and I understood that we were talking about more than abstract philosophy. We were naming the thing that had been building between us all week, the pull that made every shared glance feel like a conversation, every accidental touch feel like a revelation. That night, we ordered room service again and ate sitting on the bed, the television playing something neither of us was watching. Marcus fell asleep first, wine and exhaustion finally overcoming the careful energy he'd been maintaining all week. But instead of retreating to his own side of the bed, he settled with his head near my arm, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breathing against my skin. I didn't move. I lay in the dark listening to the rhythm of his sleep, matching my own breathing to his, letting myself exist in this space where nothing had been decided, but everything felt possible. The light stayed off. The moment stretched and deepened, and I let it happen without touching, without naming it, without doing anything that might break the spell of proximity and unspoken understanding. For the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own life. Desire might mean danger, but lying there in the dark, I finally understood why people chose it anyway. The drinks with the Northbridge executives had run longer than expected. 3 rounds at a downtown bar with exposed brick and craft cocktails. The kind of place designed to make business negotiations feel like casual conversations between friends. Marcus had been more animated than usual, flush with the success of our presentations, telling stories that made everyone laugh, while I watched the way his hands moved when he talked, the way his smile reached his eyes when he was genuinely enjoying himself. By the time we returned to the hotel, it was past midnight. The elevator ride to the 18th floor felt different somehow, charged with the wine we'd consumed and the satisfaction of a week's work completed successfully. Marcus leaned against the wall, still talking about something one of the executives had said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that comes when professional walls finally come down. I fumbled with the key card at our door, hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way he smelled like expensive whiskey and the cologne he wore that I'd been noticing for 3 years without admitting to myself that I was noticing it. The lock clicked open and we stumbled inside, the familiar sterile comfort of the hotel room wrapping around us like a cocoon. Marcus kicked off his shoes and loosened his tie, that same ritual I'd watched every night, but somehow it felt different now, more intimate, as if the casual undressing was meant for me to witness. He moved to the window, looking out at the Vancouver skyline, the city lights blurring slightly in the glass, and I found myself studying his reflection, the way his shoulders had relaxed, the slight sway that suggested the wine had affected him more than he'd let on. "Great week," he said, not turning around. "I think we actually pulled it off." I agreed, moving to pour myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the desk, trying to create distance between us because the alternative felt too dangerous. But Marcus turned then, and suddenly the space between us felt charged with all the conversations we'd been having around the edges of something larger. "Julian," he said, my name carrying weight in his voice that made my pulse quicken. He took a step toward me, then another, until we were standing closer than professional courtesy required. His eyes were bright with wine and something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "If I kissed you right now, would you pretend it didn't happen?" The question hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. Every careful boundary I'd constructed over 3 years of working together, over 20 years of living a life that looked right from the outside, condensed into this single moment of choice. My heart was beating so hard I was certain he could hear it, and when I opened my mouth to respond, the truth came out before I could stop it. "I don't think I could," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment that felt like eternity, we stood facing each other in the lamplit room, the weight of admission settling between us like something alive. Marcus reached up, his hand hovering near my face, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his palm without actual contact. Close enough that leaning forward slightly would have closed the distance that had defined our relationship for 3 years. But then his phone rang. The sound cut through the moment like a blade, sharp and intrusive and impossible to ignore. Marcus stepped back immediately, the spell broken, reaching for the device on the nightstand with the reflexive efficiency of someone who'd been trained to always be available. "Sarah," he said, his voice shifting into the tone he used for family obligations. His sister's name, spoken like an apology to me for the interruption. "Hey, what's wrong?" I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but from Marcus's responses, patient, soothing, the voice of someone who'd been managing family crises for years, it was clear that whatever had prompted the late-night call required his full attention. He walked toward the bathroom, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in the gesture I'd learned meant he was switching into problem-solving mode. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unsteady, trying to process what had almost happened. The wine was wearing off, leaving behind a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. Marcus's voice was a low murmur from behind the bathroom door, punctuated by long pauses as he listened to his sister's crisis, and I found myself wondering if the moment would still exist when he returned, or if the interruption had given us both permission to pretend it had never happened. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral, professional. "Family emergency," he said, not meeting my eyes directly. "Sarah's having issues with her landlord. I might need to fly to Portland this weekend to help her move." "Of course," I said, matching his tone, both of us performing the ritual of colleagues sharing temporary space, nothing more. The almost kiss felt like something I might have imagined, a wine-induced fantasy that couldn't survive the harsh light of practical conversation. But later, after Marcus had fallen asleep and I lay staring at the ceiling, I found myself remembering college. A party in someone's basement, music too loud and beer too warm, and Reese Morrison sitting beside me on a couch that smelled like cigarettes and spilled drinks. Dark hair and green eyes, and a smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the room worth talking to. The kiss had lasted maybe 10 seconds. His hand on the back of my neck, the taste of cheap beer and possibility, the way my entire world had tilted on its axis before I'd pulled away and made some excuse about needing air. I'd avoided him for the rest of college, crossed the quad when I saw him coming, buried that moment so deep I'd convinced myself it had never happened. Until now. I got up and walked to the bathroom, closing the door softly behind me. In the harsh fluorescent light, I looked at myself in the mirror, 41 years old, tired lines around my eyes, hair that was more silver than brown. But for the first time in decades, I looked honest. "I'm not who I said I was," I whispered to my reflection, the words barely audible even in the silence. The man in the mirror nodded back, finally ready to stop pretending. The final morning arrived with the kind of gray Vancouver drizzle that made everything feel temporary. Our bags sat packed by the door, professional luggage waiting to return us to our separate lives, but neither of us moved toward checkout with any urgency. Marcus stood at the window with his coffee, watching the harbor traffic with the focused attention of someone avoiding more immediate conversations. I found myself reorganizing papers that didn't need reorganizing, checking my phone for messages that weren't there, performing the small rituals of delay. We'd barely spoken since the phone call, since the moment that had almost happened and then dissolved into the careful politeness of colleagues sharing temporary space. But the air between us still held the weight of unfinished business, of words that had been spoken and couldn't be taken back. When we finally left the room, Marcus walking ahead of me down the carpeted hallway, I felt like I was leaving something essential behind. The flight home was turbulent again, spring storms chasing us back across the continent. But this time Marcus didn't fall asleep against the window. We sat side by side in business class seats that felt too close and not close enough simultaneously, both of us pretending to read quarterly reports while the plane shuddered through pockets of rough air. Every accidental brush of elbows felt electric. But when I glanced at Marcus, he was staring determinately at his laptop screen, jaw tight with the kind of concentration that looked like armor. By the time we landed, collected our luggage, and stood in the terminal waiting for separate rides home, we'd managed to discuss quarterly projections and client follow-ups with the professional efficiency that had defined our working relationship for 3 years. But underneath the familiar rhythm of corporate small talk, I could feel something fragile and important breaking apart. Back in the townhouse, routine returned with the relentless predictability of water finding its level. Black coffee from the machine Evelyn had left behind. NPR playing low while I knotted my tie in the hallway mirror. The refrigerator calendar still showing her abandoned appointments, months of planned dental cleanings and book club meetings that would never happen. At the office, Marcus and I fell back into our professional patterns with the practiced ease of people who'd spent years perfecting the art of appropriate distance. He arrived 7 minutes late with coffee from across the street, drummed his fingers against his thigh during conference calls, made everyone laugh during particularly tedious budget meetings. I brought donuts to department gatherings, remembered birthdays, stayed late when deadlines loomed. But something had changed in the quality of our avoidance. Where before I'd watched him with the careful attention of someone nursing a secret attraction, now every glance felt loaded with the memory of almost touch, of words that had been spoken and couldn't be unspoken. The space between our desks felt simultaneously vast and intimate, charged with the kind of tension that made ordinary interactions feel dangerous. 2 weeks after Vancouver, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Just 2 words, "You okay?" I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard, crafting and deleting responses that all felt either too honest or not honest enough. Finally, I set the phone aside without answering, telling myself that some conversations were better left unhad, some questions better left unasked. But that night, I found myself driving through the city with no particular destination, letting muscle memory guide me through neighborhoods I rarely visited. It wasn't until I'd been sitting in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, heat fogging the windows, that I realized where I was. Marcus's apartment building rose in front of me, a converted warehouse in the arts district with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of exposed brick that suggested someone with opinions about aesthetics. I could see lights on the 3rd floor, a warm glow that might have been his living room, and I sat watching like some middle-aged stalker, trying to summon the courage to get out of the car, to walk up those stairs, to finish the conversation we'd started in a Vancouver hotel room. But courage felt like a foreign concept, something other people possessed naturally, while I'd spent 41 years perfecting the art of careful retreat. I was still sitting there, paralyzed by the gap between wanting and acting, when someone knocked on my passenger window. Marcus stood in the drizzle without an umbrella, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, looking tired and determined, and somehow not surprised to find me parked outside his building like a lost tourist. He opened the passenger door and slid into the seat beside me, bringing with him the smell of rain and the particular warmth that I'd been missing without realizing it. For a moment we sat in silence, windshield wipers marking time against the steady precipitation, both of us staring straight ahead as if the answer to everything might be written in the Vancouver rain that had followed us home. "I didn't make it weird," Marcus said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "You did, by pretending it meant nothing." The words hit me like cold water, sharp with the accuracy that comes when someone sees through your carefully constructed defenses. I felt something crack open in my chest, 20 years of careful compartmentalization finally giving way under the weight of honesty. "It meant everything," I said, my voice breaking on the admission. "That's why I couldn't touch it." Marcus turned to look at me then, and I saw my own fear reflected in his expression, mixed with something that looked like relief. "I've spent my whole life avoiding who I am," I continued, the words coming faster now, like water through a broken dam. "Building a life that looked right from the outside, marrying someone I loved but wasn't in love with, choosing comfort over truth every single time. You didn't scare me, Marcus. You made me want to live." We sat in the rain-soaked car, 2 middle-aged men finally admitting to desires we'd spent years pretending didn't exist, and I felt something fundamental shift in the space between us. Not resolution, not answers, but the beginning of questions I was finally brave enough to ask. We didn't kiss that night in the rain-fogged car. We didn't make promises or declarations, didn't map out the geography of what came next. Instead, we sat in honest silence while the windshield wipers marked time and the city moved around us, both of us understanding that some transformations require space to breathe before they can fully take shape. Marcus touched my hand briefly before getting out of the car, skin against skin for just a moment, warm and real, and completely different from all the accidental contact we'd shared over 3 years of careful professional distance. Then he was gone, walking back toward his building through the rain, shoulders straight, not looking back. I drove home through empty streets, past the closed shops and darkened office buildings where other people lived their careful, compartmentalized lives. The townhouse felt different when I unlocked the front door, as if admitting the truth aloud had changed the quality of the silence that lived in these rooms. I stood in the entryway for a long time, keys still in my hand, listening to the particular quiet of a life finally ready to be examined. In the bedroom, I found myself standing before the nightstand where a photograph had lived for 8 months, face up, a monument to the comfort I'd mistaken for love. It showed Evelyn and me at her sister's wedding 2 summers before the divorce, both of us smiling the kind of practice smile that comes when you've learned to perform happiness for cameras. We looked prosperous, stable, like people who'd made all the right choices for all the right reasons. I picked up the frame and studied our faces with the distance that comes from finally understanding the difference between what looks right and what feels true. Evelyn deserved better than the half-present husband I'd been, deserved someone who could love her with full engagement rather than careful affection. And I deserved the chance to discover who I might become when I stopped performing a version of myself designed to satisfy everyone else's expectations. I turned the photograph face down, the small gesture feeling enormous in the lamplit quiet of the bedroom. Not an act of anger or rejection, but of gentle acknowledgement that this chapter had ended, that the story I'd been telling myself about who I was supposed to be had finally run its course. As I prepared for bed, moving through the familiar rituals of nighttime routine, I found myself thinking about the hotel room in Vancouver, about the weight of Marcus's breathing in the darkness, about the moment when desire had finally been named and the world hadn't ended. I thought about Reese Morrison and that kiss in a college basement, about all the years I'd spent convinced that wanting something different meant wanting something dangerous. It was while putting away the day's clothes that I found it, folded neatly in the pocket of the suit jacket I'd worn during our final Vancouver presentation. A piece of hotel stationery, my name written across it in Marcus's careful handwriting. I unfolded it with trembling fingers, not sure what I expected to find. "When you're ready, you know where I'll be. M." The words were simple, direct, carrying none of the careful ambiguity that had defined so much of our professional communication. He'd written them knowing I might never find the note, or might find it months later when the moment had passed and the courage had faded. But he'd written them anyway, a small act of faith in the possibility that I might finally choose truth over comfort. I read the note 3 times, memorizing the shape of his handwriting, the particular slant of letters formed by someone who still believed in the power of honest communication. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet, next to the credit cards and insurance information and all the other documentation of a life lived responsibly, predictably, safely. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in months, without the usual parade of anxious thoughts that typically accompanied the transition from waking to sleep. I dreamed of hotel rooms and rain-fogged car windows, of conversations that mattered and touch that meant something, of the particular courage required to finally show someone who you really are. When I woke, winter light was filtering through the bedroom curtains, bright and clean and full of possibility. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching snow begin to dust the suburban streets where other people were beginning their careful morning routines. But instead of settling into my own familiar patterns, I found myself reaching for my coat. The air outside was sharp with winter promise, cold enough to make breath visible, clean in the way that only comes with the first snow of the season. I left my coat unbuttoned, felt the wind against my chest, my hands bare and warming slowly as I walked. The suburban streets were quiet at this hour, peaceful in a way that felt like permission rather than isolation. I walked past the coffee shop where I'd bought careful small talk with the same barista for 2 years, past the grocery store where I'd learned to shop for one person, past all the landmarks of the life I'd constructed so carefully and lived so cautiously. With each step, the note in my wallet felt less like a question and more like a map, pointing toward a version of myself I was finally ready to meet. The snow continued to fall, covering the familiar world in something new, and I kept walking into it, finally ready to discover what came next.